Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Shevuos daf Mem Gimel Shevuos 43. Today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim, that's all for the Shvayim, a Yeshua for Am Yisrael, and this Eis Tzara. And the daf will begin after the Mishnah on the bottom of 42b, 7 lines from the bottom. The Mishnah had said there are certain things that you don't swear about, and if you violated them, you don't have the normal punishments. These things are the slaves, avadim, shtaros, contracts, karkos, real estate, vactatios, and items owned by the temple. So it says that if you steal any of these things, you don't pay double. Tashlume kefel. We're going to basically say the same sugya 3 times in a row at the very beginning. How do we know you don't pay double if you steal avadim, shtaros, karko, or hektish? Where it says the ton of abundance in a Bryce, it says in the pasuk, I'll call it a call protocol. It's a limud from a verse. I'll call davar. And if you take anything, you pay double. That's a klal. That's a kol davar pesha. That's a klal. And then it does a specific. Al shor, al chamor, al sev, al salma. That's a specific. An ox, a donkey, a garment. That's a prat. Al kol aveda. Then it goes back and gives any lost object. That's a klal. Chazer a klal. Prat to klal. Klal prat to klal. Yatadana kena pratim. This is a law from the Torah. Whenever it's a general followed by a specific followed by a general, you always only follow anything like the specific. Just like the specific is something that the category is something that can be moved and is intrinsically mammon, intrinsically money, as intrinsic value. Also, anything that can be moved and is intrinsically mammon. So we exclude real estate, which is not money. We exclude slaves because they are comparable to real estate. We exclude contracts, even though it's immovable. They're not intrinsically money, they're just a proof for the money. And hektish, and why is hektish excluded? Why is sacred property? Because if it says Yishalim Shneim, he has to pay double to his friend, and the temple is not your friend, the temple is the temple. So now we have the next piece, which is very similar to the first piece. It says in our Mishnah about all these items, you don't pay tashlume arba v'chamisha. If you steal an ox or a lamb of the temple and then you slaughter or sell it, you don't pay 4 or 5 times the amount. My time. And what's the reason? This penalty is only by a hedge, but not by hektish. What's the reason? Tashlume arba v'chamisha. When you pay 4 or 5 times the amount, tashlume shalosh arba, but not 3 or 4, because since you have kefel by hektish. So therefore, it would only be it's not 4 or 5 times from scratch. It's basically 3 or 4 times the double. And so therefore, since you don't have the double, therefore it would only end up being 3 or 4 times. And so therefore, it doesn't apply. Shomer chinam, also a person who's an unpaid watchman who normally would swear that he was not negligent. In this case, he doesn't swear about these items. Avadim, shtaros, karka, and hektish. So the Gemara says, why not? Minani mili. What's the source? And the Gemara says the same idea. The Tana Rabbanan, learn out from the pasuk, from the Brisa. What does it say? It says in the pasuk, Ki yitein ish areyehu kasef hakilim mashmor v'gunam v'beis ha'ish mimatzi aganav yishalim shnayim. So it says, Ki yitein ish areyehu. If a man gives to his friend, that's a klal, that's a general rule. We're on top of 43a. Kasef okelim, that's money or utensils. That's a prat, that's a specific. Lishmor, and then it says to wash them. Chazer klal, prat to klal. That's a general followed by specific, followed by a general. And we say in this context, yatadana in a prat. We follow only the specific. Just like the specific is something explicit and it's inherently money. Also something basically so to anything that's movable and inherently money. Yatsu karkos, shei metaltalin. We exclude real estate that's not money. Yatsu avadim, shehukshu karkos. We exclude slaves that are comparable to real estate. Yatsu shtaros, shafisha metaltalin, ain't gufo mammon. And it's the same limit as before in hektish. And the reason why we exclude hektish, if you are watching a shomer china for hektish, you don't swear because re'eu, if it says in this pasuk also the word re'eu, and that's not hektish. Now we have the next idea. As I said, it's the same limit 3 times. And here we're talking about a no-say sachar, a hired watchman, even though he normally pays for theft, uh, uh, even though he normally pays for theft and loss, in this case he doesn't. He's exempt. No-say sachar ain't a mashal. We know what's the source. The Tanur Rabbanan, it says in the pasuk. It says in the pasuk, that's a klal, that's a general rule. Chamor shoro said, a donkey or an ox or lamb, that's a prat. V'chol behema l'shmor, and then any animal to watch, chazer or klal prat to klal, same idea, and hekdesh re'euksiv. So it's basically the same type of limud 3 times in a row. And now, Rabbi Meir had said in our Mishnah, there are certain things that are like real estate, but they're not real estate. Meaning real estate we don't swear about, but there are certain things that are like real estate, but they're not real estate. What is that? That's a vineyard laden with grapevines laden with grapes. You don't swear about that. Whereas Chachamim say, if you do a partial admission about it, Rabbi Meir says you would swear because even though it's like real estate, it's not real estate. So that's what Rabbi Meir says. The Chum don't agree with him about that principle. And the Mishnah said, what are we talking about? Let's say you say, I gave you 10 grapevines laden with grapes. And he says, no, you only gave me 5. Rabbi Meir says you would take the oath. And the Chum say you wouldn't take the oath because it's real estate. So the Gemara says, Mikal, the Rabbi Meir savar kol mechubar karka eno kekarka. From here we see the principle that Rabbi Meir is in the position that even though it's attached to the ground, anything that's attached to the ground is not going to be considered real estate. And so therefore, even though the grapevines are attached to the ground, they're not the ground itself. They're not considered real estate. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if that's what you want to say, why does Rav Meir say they're specifically arguing about a case where the grapevines are laden with grapes? Which means to say it's a bigger chiddush. Why don't they do, if you're saying anything that's attached to the ground, it could even be grapevines that are not laden with grapes, and that will be enough. Why does they have to say specifically that it's laden with grapes? So Gemara says so. It must be to teach us something else. So Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina. So it must be that what Rabbi Meir is saying, and why is it not real estate here? Because these are grapes that are about to be harvested. The Rabbi Meir savar kibtzuras time, and he says since it's about to be harvested, we view it as though it's harvested, and so that's why it's not attached to the ground. That's why it's not karka. Rabbanan savri lo kibtzuras time. Rabbanan say no, it's not like it's harvested, even though it's about to be harvested. Next piece, it says, "Ein nishbain al dav el al darash shabamido shabamishkol." You don't take an oath. Baruch Hashem Boker Tov. You don't take an oath of it unless it's something. If it's a motive of mitzvah, unless it's about something that's quantifiable, something of a measure. What's the matter? Oh, okay. Then the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, Lo Shanu. So it said in the Mishnah, we're in the middle of 43a, 2 lines above where they get wide. It said in the Mishnah, what does it mean when you say you don't take an oath unless it's something that's quantifiable? The Mishnah said, let's say a person says, I gave you a full bias. A bias is a room or a house. A full room I gave to you, a full wallet I gave to you. And the other one says, I don't know what you gave me, whatever's here you could take, then he's exempt. That's not considered a motive of miktas. But if he says, I gave you up until this hole or up until this window, so it's something specific, then he's liable. So the Gemara says, so basically if he says, bayezeh, that's not called a quantifiable amount, and so then you don't take an oath on it. So Amar Abaye, lo shanu, when do we say that if he says, I gave you a bias, you don't take an oath? That's only where he says, bias tam. He says, I gave you a house, because he doesn't say which house, so it's not quantifiable. But if he says, I gave you that house, I gave you that specific house, and he points at it, then then we know exactly how much he's making a claim for, so it's quantifiable. So therefore, it's a motive of mitzvah, because this guy says, I gave you something in that house, and this guy returns less than that, then it's a motive of mitzvah. And just like he said, up until the window, and he doesn't give him up until the window. So That's what Abaye says. I'm like Rava, Ihachi. No, Rava says I have a problem with that. Ihachi, if that's the case, at the Tani Seifa, Zelmer at Aziz, Zelmer at Acholon. If that's the case, when it says in the next clause, one guy says until the window, one guy says until the pole, or he says up until the window, Chayiv, you're liable for Modim Mikzas, meaning to say, one guy says up until the pole, and this one says no, only up until the window. That's the case of Modim and Mikdas. Well, if that's the case, if you're saying that there's a distinction between bias and bias zeh, at the time, it should have listening with the day. It shouldn't have brought in a case from a bias then gone to a window. It should have brought the case in directly in the house itself and say, "B'medvar." Remember, when do we say that? If you say a bias, you don't take an oath. If you say bias moay, or bias zeh. Moe chayiv. If you say a bias in general, you don't think it's not quantifiable. But if you say this house, you'd be liable. Therefore, Rava says a different inyan. El am Rava la'om eno chayiv ad sheyitanenu b'davar shebamida shebamishkol v'sheb'minyan v'yodola b'davar shebamida shebamishkol v'sheb'minyan. Rava says you're only liable for Shevuos moed mixas when the claim is on a specific quantifiable amount. And the admission is also on a quantifiable amount. And Tanya Kavase de Rava, and indeed we have a brisa like Rava that supports this idea. Because let's say a person says, Kur tvua libiyatcha. He says, you have a kur as a bushel. You have a bushel of my grain. And the other one says, I don't have anything, butter. He's exempt. That's kofar hakol. Let's say he says, Menorah gedola yesh libiyatcha. He says, you have a large candelabrum, a large lamp. He says, El Chabiyadi al Menorah Katana. Well, that's also like a kofar hakol. It's not a motive of mixas. Because I have a small lamp. That's not a motive of mixas. We'll see why in a moment. Amar well kur tevua yeshli biyadcha. But if he says, he says azura gadola yeshli biyadcha. He says you have a large belt in my possession. Then also we say, if he says they're a small belt, he's going to be exempt. Because these are not hodam minatana. It's not from the same item. They're two totally different items. But if he says you have a bushel, and he says, I don't have a core, but I have a lesach, half of a core. Then we're going to say, then he has to bring an oath. Chayev. Menorah bath, eser, litrin, yeshli biyad. He says, I have a menorah that weighs 10 pounds of silver, 10 ounces, who knows? That's in my possession. He says, El chabiyadi elach bas chamesh litrin. He says, no, it's only 5. Chayev, that's a mode of a mixas. And the Gemara is going to explain what's the distinction between the case of a large menorah, a small menorah, which it says is not, that's a kofar hakol, or it's a hodah, not from the minataina. And in this case, we have 10-liter versus 5-liter. And then we have the last, and then the brisa says, Klal shel davar, olam eno chayev says, so basically, the Gemara brings the proof. The Gemara brings the proof from the brisa, proof for Rava. What's the principle? So he's only going to be liable if he makes a claim for something that's a specific quantifiable amount, and that's what it admits to. Like in the case of the menorah, it's 10-liter and 5-liter. So that's the only way he's going to be liable. So the Gemara says, and this is a proof, Kol shel davar la'asuyei mai, and what's it coming to include? Lav la'asuyei bayis zeh moed. Isn't it coming to include where you say bayis zeh moed? The guy makes a claim, this house will be complete, this full house, and he's not under those circumstances, he's not going to be liable for an oath because it's not a specific quantifiable amount. So even if you say this house, it's not enough because it needs to be you need to be specifically quantifiable, and you need to have hodah with that's also quantifiable. So isn't it to include that? So the Gemara says, so the Gemara seems to say that that's a proof, but the Gemara now says, "Umay shna menorah gadol menorah katana." The Gemara says, "Wait 1 second. Why in a case where you make a claim for a large menorah and he says I only have a small menorah? Why there do we say it's go for alcohol? You don't take an oath because mashatanu lo hodalo masha hodalo lo tanu. But the claim was not matched the admission. Two totally separate items. Well, if that's the case, but eser bas chamesh nami mashatanu lo hodalo masha hodalo lo tanu lo. So also in the case of where you make it for a menorah of 10 liter and you get 5 liter, it also should be the same idea that the claim does not match, the admission does not match the claim. So what's the difference between the two cases? So I'm Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak hacha b'menorio shachoyos askinan the kamodue minei. So he says, no, here in the Brisa, we're talking about a menorah that is put together with different pieces. The kamodue minei, that he's basically admitting to him by a portion of the menorah that he's claiming. He says, you have my menorah which has 20 pieces, and he admits to them that my menorah has your menorah, I have your menorah, but only has 10 pieces. And so therefore it's not the same as a large menorah versus a small menorah. A large menorah is, let's say, like a truck. A small menorah is, let's say, a car, two totally separate items. But in the case where he's liable to take an oath is because he says, I gave him a menorah which has 20 appendages and actually only has 10. He says, no, it has 10, so that's a motive of mikzah. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, look me b'delightful. So why don't we say that the second case of the Brisa is dealing with a belt that's 10 amos long, and he says, no, my belt is only 5 amos long, and we could establish that the scenario is by a belt that is made up of many different pieces, and then I connect them with like Velcro or something. So the Gemara says, no, why not? Elab delightful katani. No, it's not. It's obviously not talking about such a case, and so therefore, so we're not talking about such a case. So we're not talking about a case where the menorah is made up of pieces. So if that's the case, why in a large menorah and you admit to a small menorah, do we say it's a total denial? But in the case of a menorah of 10 liter versus 5 liter, we say it's a partial admission. So it says Rav Abba bar Mamel Shani menorah hol v'yochel agoro amidan al chamish liter. So if it is a large menorah, a small menorah, two separate items, like a truck versus a car, but if it is he said, I gave you a menorah of 10 pounds, and he says, no, it was 5 pounds. Well, that's really the same item because you could whittle down, you could shave off the menorah and make it 5 and make it half the weight, and so therefore it's a partial admission. But by a large menorah and a small menorah, you can't do that. And also by a belt, she says you can't do that. You can't just whittle it down because the head of the belt is recognizable. So now we're up to the next Mishnah. Let's say you lend your friend money on a mashkon, basically on a collateral. You say, I want to borrow $100. He says, okay, give me your watch. And he loses the mashkon. So Reuven lends Shimon money, and Shimon gives him his watch, and Reuven loses the watch. Amarlo. So now Reuven says to Shimon, Sela, I lent you a Sela. This shekel ayashave. And Shimon responds, no, it was not worth a Sela. It was worth a shekel. A shekel is half a Sela. He says, no, Sela visani. The Sela ayashave. He says, no. It was worth a Sela. The watch that you lent me a Sela, and the mashkon I gave you was a Sela. So he's basically denying that he owes anything, and I don't owe you anything. So the borrower says I'm exempt. Potter, in that case, he's exempt. But let's say he says Sela v'sichalav the shekel yeshav. He says I lent you a Sela, and it's worth a half a Sela, the watch that I lost. He says, you lent me a Sela, but the watch was worth 3 dinars, so I only owe you 1 dinar. Then it's motive of mixus, partial admission, so he's liable for an oath. Let's say he says, the borrower says, Sela Hovi Sunny Olav. Let's say he said, the borrower says, you lent me a seller, and you owe me, and my watch is worth two, so you owe me that too. Meaning to say, he says, you lent me a seller, and my watch was worth two seller, so you owe me a seller, the borrower says to the lender. And the lender responds, no, it was only worth a seller. He basically says, I don't owe you any money because the watch was worth the loan. Potter is exempt. But if he says, let's say the borrower says, you lent me a seller and I gave you a watch which was worth two. And the other one says, no, he says it was worth 5 dinars. So I owe you 3 dinarim. Chayev, he's liable to take an oath because then the lender is doing a partial denial, partial admission. Mi nishba, and now the Mishnah says at the end, who's the one who takes the oath? Misha pikadon, the one who has a deposit with him, i.e., the lender. And the Gemara is going to explain which clause that phrase is referring to. Why? We're worried. Shema yishava zeviotzi hawasa pikadon. We're worried that maybe the borrower will take the oath, and the lender will then produce the pikadon, the deposit, and that'll be a big problem. So the Gemara says this phrase, who takes the oath, the one with whom the deposit is with, we're on top of 43b. Ahai, what's it referring to? Ilema aseifa, if you want to say it's referring to the last clause, where it says the borrower makes the claim from the lender and for two seller that the watch is worth, and the lender says it was worth 5 dinarim. If that, and so then the lender has to take an oath. Typically, of course, he has to take the oath. The lender is the one who's doing the partial denial. So for sure, partial admission, for sure he has to take the oath. Typically, the Shua Gabi Malva, of course, the lender has to take the oath. So Amar Shmuel Areisha, so it's referring to the clause where the borrower is the one who's doing the partial denial. He says it was worth 3 dinarim, so I only owe you a dinar. So in that case, the lender takes the oath. So the Gemara says, my Reisha, which Reisha? Stay for the Reisha. Is it this clause where he says, I lent you a seller of a shekel hayashave, and the watch is worth half of that. And the borrower says, no, kill a seller of his sonny alav. You lent me a seller ushlosha dinar hayashave, and it was worth shlosha dinar, so I only owe you 1 dinar. So then he's chayev deshvua gabe lovi, because really the oath has to be supposed to be with the borrower. Vishakul rabbanan, the rabbanan took it away. Milo vevishajua malvan, they stuck it on the lender. So that's the case. The hasha the amar of Ashi, but now the Rav Ashi says the kaimalon zeh nishpa she'ena b'reshusel v'zeh nishpa tamashava. But now we have a teaching. The Rav Ashi says this one has to take an oath that he no longer has it. That's the lender. And the borrower has to take an oath how much it was worth. This is what. So if that's the case, this is what the Tana of our Mishnah means to say. This is what he's saying. Who takes the oath first? Misha pikadon etzlo, one who has a deposit with him, i.e. the lender. Shema yishava zeh v'yotzi halas pikadon. Because otherwise we're worried that the lender will take the oath and then the borrower will produce a deposit. Amar Shmuel, so now Shmuel says, following case, which is going to take us into tomorrow's taf, Haiman to Uspe Alpha Zuze Lechavre, Umashkin Lekata de Magla. So a person lends his friend 1,000 zuz, and he gets as a collateral a handle of an axe, obviously worth much less than 1,000 zuz. Aved Kata de Magla, Aved Alpha Zuze. If he loses the handle of the axe, he's lost his 1,000 zuz. Avoltarte Pitati, well, but if he got 2 handles and he lost 1, then he just loses the value of the handle. Because, and Rashi explains, we don't say that he got 1 handle for 500 and the other handle for the other 500. If he loses 1, he doesn't lose 500 because he didn't say specifically half is for 1 and the other half is for the other. 1 is for half and the other is for the other part. And so therefore, he just has to pay what he's missing from the mashkon, not the entire half. So that's what Shmuel said. The Rav Nachman Amar afilu tarti katati avad. Afilu tarti katati, even if he has two handles, avad chada, avad chamesh. Avad idach, avad koi. So Rav Nachman disagrees with Shmuel. He says even if you got two, if you just lose one, you lose half the value. Basically, the two mashkons, each mashkon is equivalent to half. So Gemara avoida aval chada aval chamesh mea aval ida aval koi aval kata v'nafka touch of Nachman. But if one would be an accent on the which is basically worth nothing, and the other would be a block of precious metal, then we would say aval palga. Then we would say I feel so says Rav Nachman I feel but avocado and askalo. But if you have an accent on an aska and you lose the accent, then we're not going to say you lost half because clearly the aska is worth much more than the accent. But Nardaya, Amri, the third position, they'd say afilu kata naska. Even if you have an axe handle and a precious piece of metal of a naska of a palga, if you lose even just a naska, you lost half. Avakate avakua, and then when you lose the axe handle, you lost the other half. So the Gemara challenges Shmuel's position from our Mishnah. The Gemara challenges Shmuel's position from our Mishnah. Really, it's a question on all of them, but from the end of the Gemara, it's clear that it's a challenge to Shmuel because our Mishnah says you just look at the value of the mashkon. You don't say that the mashkon is equivalent to the entire loan. So the Gemara cites our Mishnah: sell it tanan, sell it v'ticha. No, but why? Why is he liable to take an oath there? Haki balte. Why doesn't he say, look, you got my mashkon, and so therefore it's equivalent to the loan, so I don't owe you anything. The Gemara says, no. Masnisim b'deparish and Shmuel b'delo parish. Our Mishnah is talking about where he specified. He says specifically, I'm only accepting it not for the full value of the loan, but for the value of the mashkon. And so therefore he doesn't lose the whole loan. But Shmuel's talking about a case where he just accepted a mashkon and didn't specify the value. Okay, so this is today's daf. Tomorrow's daf we'll do, God willing, on noon today and